Hi everyone, and welcome to the very first episode of my video games and geography video series. In this first episode, I will identify a starting point for a common ground between video games and geography, that being through the concept of landscapes. While in geography, video games as a medium to be studied has been underrepresented, I believe that the theories on landscape can be directly applied to video games, serving as a foundation to making sense of the virtual landscapes that the players inhabit. In the book The Social Construction of Landscape, Olaf Kuhne and his colleagues attempt to do this exactly. In the opening chapter, they pose that the concept of landscape within the context of gaming is a constructivist one, founded on the three worlds theory by Karl Popper. Through this theory, Popper divides the world into three different levels. Level 1 being the material realm, Level 2 being the mental realm, and Level 3 being the cultural realm. In virtual landscapes, this would translate into the physical ordering of the virtual landscape, the individual construction of this landscape, and finally the socially mediated patterns of interpretation, evaluation, and categorization. An alternative interpretation of the three-world theory is offered by Carsten Baer, who suggests that within the realm of play, there is first the ontological world, secondly the aesthetic/psychological world, and finally the cultural world. While this notion might seem a little bit abstract and complicated, ultimately the idea is simply that landscape representations in games are not an independent entity, so they don't exist on their own, but rather that they reflect the cultural norms and ideas that we find in the real world. So the biggest question then seems, why should we look at video games specifically? After all, the aforementioned theories are primarily applied to the concept of play in general, so why would we not, for example, study board games or children playing outside for that matter? Now I asked myself this question too, and the answer I found in a book called The Journal of Media Geography, which is a great handbook written by a bunch of media geographers. The book boasts an impressive collaboration of media geographers with names such as James Crane, Jason Dittmer, Chris Lukenbiel, and Paul Adams, just to name a few. And in this book, the authors claim that what makes video games unique as a medium is their ability to highlight the role of labor in landscape production. So, just to clarify, in the real world, we are often presented with the final product of landscape production or transformation. So, think for example about a fancy shopping mall or a lush orchard. And this also goes for more traditional forms of art or media. So for example, if we think about a painting of a landscape, then what we are presented with is the final product and not the process of the labor of the painter themselves. So this is what video games do differently. They put the player in the driver's seat. So as a player, you take on the painter painting the painting. And it is not about how the painting looks in the end, it is about the process of painting it. So this aspect of labor or of hard work that goes into how a landscape comes to be is pushed to the front in video games. And in order to really highlight this, I have selected two different genres of video games specifically that I will elaborate on further. So let's start with the crafting game. In the crafting game, we as players are put directly into the driver's seat as sculptors of the landscape. Through careful game design, the tedious part of the labor that goes into landscape transformation is filtered out, while the satisfaction of creating a new landscape is preserved. Now take for example the game House Flipper. In this game, you're, as the name suggests, someone who buys rundown houses and fixes them up to sell them for a profit. Activities to reach this goal include mowing the lawn, cleaning up trash, painting the walls, and retiling the floor, just to name some examples. Now, if I can speak for myself, I would say that I do not really enjoy doing these activities in real life. It's not really something I would choose to spend my free time on, because they are time consuming, they are exhausting, and sometimes even frustrating. Now, this game House Flipper through its careful design, removes these tedious aspects of, well, renovating a house. Instead, the main focus is on the satisfaction that you feel of transforming a landscape and taking it from its chaotic starting state into a neat and polished final product. In a similar vein, farming simulators have also become immensely popular over the last years, with my personal favorite being Stardew Valley. In this game, the very labor-intensive activities of farm life are reduced to a few simple clicks. Surely I would not enjoy maintaining a full field of corn in real life, but Stardew Valley removes the tedium for me and actually makes it fun. Maybe it could be said that while video games do include the labor part of landscape production, it doesn't actually represent it very accurately by attempting to remove the tedium of doing labor. Can we still call labor if it's not, well, labor intensive? I think this is a good argument. However, the labor is still represented more in video games than in any other form of landscape representation, even if a very physical intense process such as harvesting crops is reduced to a single mouse click. A painting, for instance, only presents us with the final product, but for video games this final product doesn't matter. Once the landscape production is fully completed, the game has served its purpose and there's no real reason to play the game anymore. In Stardew Valley, for example, players will eventually reach a point where the farm is automated to such an extent that it practically runs by itself. And I've reached this point in the game, and I can say it just isn't that much fun to play anymore when you get to this stage. When there's no more labor for the player, the game simply becomes, well, unfun to play. So a second trope in video games that I believe really highlights the labor part in landscape transformation or creation is what I call the invader genre, though for the most part these games would technically fall under the open world genre. At the start of these games, the player is introduced to a chaotic landscape that's filled with danger and is beyond the player's control. This usually involves some kind of world that is filled with evil, with some kind of enemies that must then be purged from the landscape in order to restore it to an ideological state. In Far Cry 3, for example, the player is presented with an island invaded by pirates that the player must eliminate from the island in order to restore it back to a peaceful island inhabited by natives. In Mad Max, the lands are overrun by crazy cannibal killers that the main player must purge. In Green Hell, the player is stranded in the Amazon jungle and is presented to a conflict between two tribes, one evil cannibal tribe and one peaceful nature-loving tribe. The player must save the peaceful tribe by killing the cannibals and destroying their camps. There are many more examples to be named, all from games that I have played personally, but ultimately it's kind of pointless to do so because, well, all these games revolve around the same concept. There's a chaotic landscape that the player starts in, and the player must then put in labor to restore it to order and peace. From my experience of these games, I can say three things about them. First, the landscape in these games is contested and sometimes even fought over, for example through war or some other kind of violence. Second, just like in real war, in landscape conflict the other side is presented as evil, presenting justification for violence. This is the game attempting to reassure the player that they are righteous in their acts of violence. And lastly, I have to admit, this formula makes the game very fun to play. The psychology behind this invader design is beyond my understanding, but as a player I can simply say that landscape transformation as in a video game is very fun to do and gives an immense feeling of satisfaction. So by combining landscape theory with video games, I have attempted to bring a geographical perspective to video games. And just to sum up this episode, this has shown us that first, video games are unique in the sense that they don't leave out the labor that goes into landscape production. Secondly, video game shows that landscape transformation often entails conflict. It is something that is contested and fought over to decide what belongs to whom. Thirdly, video games have the ability to make the labor that goes into landscape transformation fun. So in the case of those simulation games where you're renovating a house or something similar. And lastly, video games are not autonomous ideologies. They don't represent any values on their own, but rather they reflect the cultural and societal values from the context that they are produced in. So that marks the end of the first episode. The next episode will dive deeper into virtual landscapes, but more specifically post-apocalyptic landscapes. I will argue that post-apocalyptic video games showcase the utopian and dystopian views that are commonly held in the age of the Anthropocene, for example through ecological disaster. That was it for the first episode. See you on the next one.